Tommy Martinez wiped the sweat from his forehead as he walked along the dusty riverbank. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the small border town of Mesa Verde, where nothing much happened except the occasional tourist passing through to see the old mining ruins. At 14, Tommy had grown tired of the same routine every summer day. School was out, his friends were busy with family chores, and his grandmother was taking her afternoon nap. The Rio Seco wasn't much of a river anymore. Years of drought had reduced it to a narrow stream that barely reached Tommy's ankles in most places. But today, something was different. The recent thunderstorms had brought more water than anyone had seen in months, and the current moved faster than usual. As Tommy kicked stones into the muddy water, he heard a sound that made him stop. It was a whimpering, desperate cry that seemed to come from somewhere downstream. He followed the sound, climbing over fallen logs and pushing through the tall grass that grew along the bank. There, caught between two large rocks in the middle of the swollen stream, was a small dog. Its golden fur was matted and dirty, and it struggled weakly against the current. The animal was clearly exhausted, probably fighting the water for hours. Tommy could see that it was just a puppy, maybe 6 months old, with bright amber eyes that looked at him with a mixture of fear and hope. Without thinking twice, Tommy kicked off his sneakers and waded into the stream. The water was colder than he expected, and the current stronger. He had to be careful not to slip on the smooth rocks beneath his feet. The puppy watched him approach, too tired to bark or struggle anymore. "Easy, boy," Tommy said softly, extending his hand slowly. "I'm here to help." The dog sniffed his fingers and seemed to understand that this human meant no harm. Tommy carefully lifted the shivering animal from between the rocks, feeling how thin it was beneath the wet fur. The puppy was lighter than he expected, probably. Hadn't eaten in days. Getting back to shore proved more challenging than Tommy had anticipated. The puppy, now feeling safer, began to squirm in his arms. Tommy lost his footing once and nearly fell, but managed to keep both himself and the dog above water. When they finally reached the bank, both were breathing hard. Tommy set the puppy down gently on the grass and examined it more closely. It was definitely a mixed breed, probably part golden retriever and part something else. Despite being thin and dirty, the dog seemed healthy. No obvious injuries, just hungry and scared. "Where did you come from, boy?" Tommy asked, stroking the wet fur. The dog had no collar, no identification of any kind. It was clearly a stray, probably abandoned or lost far from home. As if in response to his kindness, the puppy managed a weak tail wag and licked Tommy's hand. That simple gesture sealed the deal. Tommy knew he couldn't just leave this animal here to fend for itself. The walk home took longer than usual because the puppy was too weak to keep up. Tommy ended up carrying it most of the way, talking to it softly about his grandmother, his town, and how everything was going to be okay now. Grandmother Elena Martinez was watering her small garden when she saw her grandson approaching with something in his arms. She was a small, sturdy woman of 72 with silver hair always pulled back in a neat bun and eyes that missed nothing. She had raised Tommy since his parents died in a car accident when he was 7, and she knew that look on his face meant trouble. "¿Qué tienes ahí, mijo?" she asked, setting down her watering can. "I found him in the river, abuela," Tommy said, using the Spanish word for grandmother that she preferred. "He was trapped and would have drowned if I hadn't helped." Elena walked closer and examined the bedraggled puppy in her grandson's arms. She had seen many strays over the years, but something about this one was different. Its eyes held an unusual intelligence, and despite being exhausted, it watched everything around it with careful attention. "He's very thin," she observed, "and dirty. Probably been on his own for weeks. Can we keep him, abuela? Please? I'll take care of everything. I'll feed him, train him, clean up after him. He won't be any trouble." Elena sighed. Money was tight, on her small pension, and a dog would mean extra expenses they could barely afford. But she also knew that Tommy had been lonely since school ended. The other kids in town were either much younger or much older, and he spent most of his time alone. "We'll see," she said, which Tommy knew was grandmother speak for probably yes. First, let's get him cleaned up and fed. Then we'll talk. They took the puppy to the small bathroom and gave him a warm bath in the old clawfoot tub. As the dirt washed away, his golden coat revealed beautiful markings, darker fur around his ears and tail, with a distinctive white patch on his chest that almost looked like a lightning bolt. Tommy wrapped the clean dog in an old towel and carried him to the kitchen. Elena heated up some leftover chicken broth and mixed it with rice. The puppy ate hungrily but carefully, as if he had learned to make food last when it was available. "What should we name him?" Tommy asked, watching the dog. "Eat." Elena studied the animal thoughtfully. There was something almost regal about the way he held himself, even exhausted and recovering. "Lobo," she said finally. "He reminds me of the wolves that used to roam these mountains." Tommy laughed. "He doesn't look much like a wolf, abuela." "No, but he has the spirit of one. Look at his eyes. This is not an ordinary dog, mijo." As if he understood the conversation, Lobo looked up from his bowl and met Elena's gaze directly. For a moment, something passed between them, a recognition that neither of them fully understood but both felt deeply. That night, Tommy made a bed for Lobo in his room using old blankets and a cardboard box. The puppy curled up gratefully. Finally, warm and safe and fed. As Tommy drifted off to sleep, he could hear Lobo's gentle breathing and felt happier than he had in months. Outside, the desert wind whispered through the scrub brush and rattled the windows of their small adobe house. In the distance, a real wolf howled at the moon, and Lobo lifted his head to listen, his ears pricked forward as if he understood something in that ancient sound. Tommy had no way of knowing that his simple act of kindness would set in motion events that would change not only his life, but the entire history of his small town. The puppy he had saved from the river carried within him a lineage that stretched back centuries, to a time when the Apache roamed freely across this land and formed bonds with wolves that lasted lifetimes. As the stars wheeled overhead and the desert settled into its nighttime quiet, the first chapter of an extraordinary friendship began. 3 weeks passed quickly in the Martinez household. Lobo had recovered completely from his ordeal in the river and had grown noticeably bigger and stronger. His golden coat now gleamed with health, and his amber eyes sparkled with intelligence and mischief. Tommy spent every waking moment with his new companion, teaching him basic commands and exploring the desert around their town. What amazed everyone who met Lobo was how quickly he learned. Tommy had never trained a dog before, but Lobo seemed to understand not just commands but intentions. When Tommy pointed in a direction, Lobo would run ahead to scout the path. When Tommy sat down to rest, Lobo would position himself to watch for any potential dangers. It was as if the dog had an instinctive understanding of how to be a protector and companion. Elena watched this growing bond with a mixture of joy and uneasiness. She had lived in this part of Arizona all her life and knew the old stories her own grandmother had told her, stories about animals that were more than they seemed, about connections between the human world and the spirit world that most people had forgotten. One morning, while Tommy and Lobo were playing fetch in the backyard, Elena noticed something that made her catch her breath. When Lobo ran, his gait was unlike any dog she had ever seen. He moved with a fluid grace that reminded her of the wolves from her childhood, but there was something else, a purposefulness in his movements that suggested he was not just playing, but practicing. "Tommy," she called from the kitchen window. "Bring Lobo inside. Mrs. Hernandez is coming for coffee." Maria Hernandez was Elena's oldest friend and the unofficial keeper of local gossip and history. She arrived carrying a basket of fresh tortillas and wearing the serious expression that meant she had important news to share. After the usual pleasantries and compliments about Elena's coffee, Maria leaned forward conspiratorially. "Have you heard about the strange things happening up in the mountains?" Elena shook her head, though she had noticed that the usual sounds of the desert had changed in recent weeks. The night calls seemed different, more organized somehow. "Pedro Santos was hunting near Eagle Peak last weekend," Maria continued, "and he swears he saw a pack of wolves. Not coyotes, Elena. Wolves. Big ones, moving like they had a purpose." "Wolves haven't been seen in these mountains for 50 years, Elena replied. but her voice carried less certainty than her words. That's what I told him, but then Carmen at the post office said her nephew saw them too, and yesterday old Jose, who runs the gas station, said a whole family of them came down to drink at his well in broad daylight. They weren't afraid, Elena. They looked at him like they were studying him. As Maria spoke, Lobo, who had been lying quietly at Tommy's feet, lifted his head and tilted it to one side as if listening carefully to every word. Tommy was reading a comic book and paying no attention to the adult conversation, but he absently scratched behind Lobo's ears when the dog moved closer to him. "There's something else," Maria said, lowering her voice even further. "My grandmother used to tell stories about times like this. She said that when the wolves returned to the mountain, it meant the old ways were stirring. Something about ancient partnerships awakening." Elena felt a chill despite the warm morning air. She glanced at Lobo, who was now watching her directly with those unusually intelligent amber eyes. That afternoon, Tommy decided to take Lobo on a longer adventure than usual. They hiked up into the foothills, following an old mining trail that wound between massive red rocks and struggling desert plants. Tommy loved these expeditions because Lobo seemed to know exactly where they were going, even though they had never been this far from home before. They stopped to rest beside a natural spring that bubbled up between the rocks. Tommy cupped his hands to drink the cool water while Lobo lapped delicately from the pool's edge. The silence of the desert surrounded them, broken only by the gentle sound of water and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. It was then that Tommy first noticed they were being watched. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, a shadow that seemed to move when he wasn't looking directly at it, a sense of eyes upon him that made the hair on his arm stand up. But Lobo's behavior confirmed that something was out there. The dog didn't seem alarmed, but he was definitely alert, his ears pricked forward and his body perfectly still as he focused on something Tommy couldn't see. "What is it, boy?" Tommy whispered. Lobo made a sound Tommy had never heard before. Not quite a whine, not quite a howl, but something in between. It was answered immediately by a similar call from somewhere up the slope. Tommy's heart began to beat faster. He had heard the stories about wolves returning to the mountains, but hearing about them and potentially encountering them were very different things. He started to back away from the spring, but Lobo didn't move. Instead, the dog sat down calmly and waited. The first wolf appeared from behind a large boulder about 50 yards away. It was massive, with a coat of silver and black and yellow eyes that seemed to glow in the afternoon sun. Tommy had never seen anything so beautiful and terrifying at the same time. He froze, unsure whether to run, climb a tree, or play dead. But the wolf wasn't looking at Tommy. Its entire focus was on Lobo. A second wolf emerged from a different direction, then a third. Soon, Tommy counted 7 wolves arranged in a loose semicircle around the spring. They were all watching Lobo with an intensity that suggested this meeting was not accidental. Lobo stood slowly and walked toward the largest wolf, the silver and black one that had appeared first. Tommy wanted to call him back, but his voice seemed to have disappeared entirely. He could only watch in amazement as his pet dog approached a wild wolf pack without any apparent fear. The two animals met in the middle of the clearing. The wolf was clearly the larger and more powerful of the two, but Lobo showed no submission. Instead, they touched noses briefly, then sat facing each other, as if having a conversation that Tommy couldn't hear. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the wolves began to withdraw as quietly as they had appeared. The pack leader looked once at Tommy, a look that seemed to convey both assessment and acceptance, then turned and trotted up the slope. Within moments, all 7 wolves had vanished into the rocky landscape as if they had never been there, at all. Lobo returned to Tommy's side, his tail wagging as if nothing unusual had just happened. He nuzzled Tommy's hand and looked up at him with an expression that clearly said, "Come on, let's go home." The hike back to town passed in a daze for Tommy. His mind raced with questions he couldn't answer. Why hadn't the wolves attacked? Why had they seemed to know Lobo? And why did he have the strange feeling that this encounter had been some kind of test or ceremony? When they reached home, Elena took one look at her grandson's face and knew something significant had happened. "Tell me," she said simply, settling into her favorite chair and preparing to listen. Tommy told her everything about the spring, the wolves, and the strange meeting he had witnessed. Elena listened without interruption, her weathered hands folded in her lap and her dark eyes growing more thoughtful with each detail. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she stood and walked to an old wooden chest in the corner of the living room. From it, she withdrew a bundle wrapped in faded cloth. "Your great-great-grandmother gave this to my grandmother," Elena said, unwrapping what appeared to be a very old photograph. She said it showed her husband with his wolf companion. "I always thought it was just a story." The photograph was sepia-toned and cracked with age, but the image was clear enough. It showed a young Apache man standing beside a large wolf, both looking directly at the camera with identical expressions of calm dignity. Tommy stared at the photograph, then at Lobo, who had come to sit beside Elena as if he too wanted to see the old picture. "Abuela?" Tommy said slowly. "What exactly did you mean when you said Lobo reminded you of the wolves that used to roam these mountains?" Elena looked at her grandson, then at the dog, then back at the faded photograph in her hands. "I think, Mijo, that some bonds are stronger than time, and some promises last longer than the lives of those who make them." The morning after Tommy's encounter with the wolf pack, Mesa Verde woke to an unusual sight. 7 wolves sat arranged in a perfect line on the ridge overlooking the town, silhouetted against the sunrise like ancient sentinels. They made no sound, and showed no signs of leaving. By noon, news of the wolves had spread throughout the small community. Sheriff Martinez, no relation to Tommy's family despite sharing the name, drove his patrol car up the winding road that led partway up the ridge. He parked as close as he could get and studied the wolves through binoculars. "They're just sitting there," he reported over the radio to his deputy. "Not hunting, not moving, just watching the town like they're waiting for something." Tommy heard about the wolves from Mrs. Chen at the corner store when he and Lobo went to buy milk for his grandmother. Other people were gathered around the store's front window, pointing up at the ridge and talking in worried voices. "Never seen anything like it in 40 years of living here," said Bob Williams, the retired mine foreman. "Wolves are supposed to be afraid of people, not set up camp overlooking our homes." Tommy felt Lobo press against his leg and looked down to see the dog watching the crowd with alert attention. There was something in Lobo's expression, a kind of patient waiting, that reminded Tommy of how he had looked just before the wolf pack had appeared at the spring. "Maybe they're not dangerous," Tommy suggested. "Maybe they're just curious about the town." Several adults turned to look at him with expressions that ranged from amused to concerned. "Son," Sheriff Martinez said, "wolves don't get curious about human settlements unless they're planning to raid them. My grandfather told me stories about wolf packs that terrorized communities back in the old days." But Elena Martinez, Tommy's grandmother, had been thinking about those same old days from a very different perspective. That afternoon, while Tommy was at the library researching wolves on the internet, she drove her old pickup truck to the reservation 30 miles away. The San Carlos Apache Reservation was home to several thousand members of the tribe, including Elena's childhood friend, Mary Crowfeather. Mary was now in her 80s and served as one of the tribal historians, keeper of the traditional stories that many younger Apache had forgotten. Elena found Mary sitting in the shade of her porch, working on a traditional basket weave that had taken her months to complete. The old women embraced warmly, speaking in a mixture of English and Apache that flowed between them like a familiar song. "I need to ask you about the old stories," Elena said, after they had caught up on family news and community gossip. "About the wolves and the partnerships with humans." Mary's weathered hands stilled on her basket work. Her dark eyes, still sharp despite her age, studied Elena's face carefully. "Why do you ask about such things, old friend?" Elena told her about Lobo, about the encounter at the spring, and about the wolves now watching over Mesa Verde. She described the old photograph her great-great-grandmother had left behind and the strange feeling that something ancient was awakening. Mary listened without interruption, nodding occasionally as if the story confirmed something she had long suspected. "The partnership," Mary said finally, "was made in the time of my great-grandfather's grandfather. When the Apache people first came to this land, the wolves were already here. Both were hunters. Both understood the rhythm of the desert. Both knew how to survive where others could not. She set down her basket and walked to the edge of her porch, looking out across the desert toward the mountains where Mesa Verde lay, hidden in a fold of the landscape. The agreement was simple but powerful, she continued. In times of great need, the wolves would come to aid their human partners. In return, when the wolves faced extinction, the humans would shelter and protect them. Each side would recognize their counterparts by signs that could not be faked or copied. What kind of signs? Elena asked. A wolf dog that moved like the wind, understood without teaching, and carried the mark of lightning on his chest, Mary replied. And humans who showed courage without hesitation, kindness without expectation, and loyalty without conditions. Elena felt her breath catch. The white patch on Lobo's chest did indeed look like a stylized lightning bolt. Mary, the wolves have been gone from these mountains for 50 years. Why would they return now? The old woman was quiet for a long time, her eyes focused on something far beyond the visible horizon. Because the need is great again, she said finally. The land is sick from drought and mining. The old ways are being forgotten. The balance is broken, and only the ancient partnerships can restore it. Meanwhile, back in Mesa Verde, Tommy was learning his own piece of the puzzle. The librarian, Mrs. Patterson, had helped him find several books about wolves and their behavior. Most of what he read made the situation even more mysterious. According to everything he could find, wolves were extremely territorial and rarely approached human settlements unless driven by starvation. They hunted in packs, but they didn't arrange themselves in neat rows and sit motionless for hours, and they certainly didn't seem to single out individual dogs for mysterious meetings at desert springs. Tommy was walking home from the library, Lobo trotting beside him, when he noticed that people were staring. Not just glancing, really staring, as if he and Lobo were some kind of curiosity or attraction. At first he thought it was because of the wolves on the ridge. Maybe people were being extra careful around any dog, even a friendly one like Lobo. But then he heard Mrs. Hernandez talking to her neighbor across a backyard fence. I'm telling you, Maria, that boy's dog knew about the wolves before they showed up. My cousin Roberto saw them together up by the old mine yesterday, and the dog was acting like he was leading the boy somewhere specific. You think the dog brought the wolves here? Maria asked. I think that dog isn't what he appears to be. Have you looked at his eyes? Dogs don't look at you like that, like they're thinking human thoughts. Tommy quickened his pace, suddenly uncomfortable with the attention. But as they walked through the center of town, more people stopped to watch them pass. Some faces showed curiosity, others concern, and a few showed something that looked almost like fear. By the time they reached home, Tommy was thoroughly unsettled. He found his grandmother in the kitchen, preparing dinner with an expression of deep thoughtfulness. Abuela, people are acting strange today. They keep staring at Lobo like he's some kind of monster or something. Elena set down her wooden spoon and turned to face her grandson. Tommy, sit down. I went to visit Mary Crow, Feather, today, and she told me some things you need to understand. She explained about the ancient partnership between the Apache and the wolves, about the signs and symbols that marked the chosen ones, and about the belief that this alliance would be renewed in times of great need. Tommy listened with growing amazement and discomfort. So you're saying Lobo isn't really just a stray dog? That he's some kind of magical wolf or something? I'm saying he's exactly what he appears to be, a dog who loves you and trusts you completely. But he may also be something more. And if he is, then you have a choice to make. What kind of choice? Elena walked to the window and pointed up toward the ridge, where the 7 wolves still maintained their patient vigil. The choice to accept a responsibility that has been passed down through generations of your ancestors. The choice to help restore a balance that has been broken. The choice to trust in something bigger than yourself. As if he understood the conversation, Lobo came and sat beside Tommy, resting his golden head on the boy's knee. His amber eyes looked up with complete trust and affection, the same expression Tommy had seen that first day by the river. What happens if I say no? Tommy asked. Then nothing changes. The wolves will eventually leave, Lobo will remain just a beloved pet, and life will go on as it always has. And if I say yes? Elena smiled, but there was sadness in her expression. Then everything changes, mijo. For all of us. Outside, the desert wind carried the sound of howling from the ridge, not the lonely call of a single wolf, but a chorus that spoke of ancient bonds and awakening powers. Tommy felt Lobo's muscles tense beneath his hand, and for just a moment he could swear he felt the dog's heartbeat synchronize with his own. The choice, Tommy realized, had probably already been made the moment he stepped into the river to save a drowning puppy. Everything else was just the universe catching up with the decision his heart had made weeks ago. He looked at his grandmother, then down at Lobo, then out toward the ridge where 7 wolves waited in the gathering dusk. "Tell me what I need to do," he said quietly. The ceremony, Mary Crowfeather explained when Elena brought Tommy to the reservation the next evening, was not complicated, but it was ancient. It required 3 things: acceptance of responsibility, proof of courage, and the blessing of both, the human community and the wolf pack. "The acceptance you have already given," Mary told Tommy as they sat around a small fire in her backyard. "By choosing to help restore the balance, you have taken the first step on a path your ancestors walked before you." Tommy felt nervous, but determined. All day, people in Mesa Verde had been talking about the wolves. Some wanted to call the state wildlife department to have them removed. Others thought the pack might attract dangerous predators to the area. A few even suggested hunting them before they became a real problem. "What kind of proof of courage?" Tommy asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "You must go to the wolves," Mary replied. "Not just see them from a distance, but walk among them as an equal. Show them that you understand the partnership and are willing to honor it." Elena squeezed her grandson's hand. She had been quiet most of the evening, but Tommy could see the worry in her eyes. "Is it dangerous?" he asked. Mary considered the question carefully. "All important things carry risk, young man. But the danger is not from the wolves. They will know whether you are sincere or not. The real danger comes from fear, your own fear, and the fear of others who don't understand what is happening." She handed Tommy a small leather pouch tied with sinew. Inside was a mixture of herbs and what looked like small carved stones. "This is medicine for the ceremony. When you reach the place where the wolves wait, scatter some of this on the ground, and speak these words. I come in peace to honor the old agreement. I offer my protection in exchange for your wisdom." Tommy tucked the pouch into his pocket. "When should I do this?" "Tonight," Mary said. "The full moon rises in 2 hours. The wolves will be waiting." The drive back to Mesa Verde passed in silence. Elena gripped the steering wheel tightly, and Tommy could see her lips moving in what he assumed was prayer. Lobo sat in the back seat, alert and calm as if he knew exactly what was going to happen. They parked at the base of the ridge road and began the hike up to where the wolves maintained their vigil. Tommy had brought a flashlight, but the rising moon provided enough light to see the rocky trail clearly. About halfway up the ridge, they encountered Sheriff Martinez coming down. He was carrying a rifle and looked surprised to see them. "Elena, what are you doing up here with the boy? It's not safe with those wolves around." "We're handling a family matter, Sheriff," Elena replied firmly. "Tommy needs to do something important." Sheriff Martinez looked skeptical. "I just spent 2 hours trying to get close enough to count them properly. They're big, Elena. Bigger than any wolves I've ever seen pictures of. And they're not afraid of humans at all." "Did they threaten you in any way?" Tommy asked. "No, that's the strange part. They just watched me, like they were studying me or something. Made my skin crawl." He shifted the rifle to his other arm. "I'm calling the state wildlife people first thing in the morning. This situation can't continue." After the sheriff left, Elena and Tommy continued up the trail. Tommy's heart beat faster with each step, but Lobo seemed increasingly excited, his tail wagging and his pace quickening. They reached the ridge just as the full moon cleared the eastern mountains. The 7 wolves were exactly where they had been all day, but now they stood rather than sat, their silver and black coats gleaming in the moonlight. Tommy took a deep breath and pulled out the leather pouch Mary had given him. His hands shook slightly as he untied the sinew and poured some of the contents into his palm. "I'll wait here," Elena said, settling onto a large rock about 20 yards from the wolves. Tommy walked forward slowly, Lobo at his side. The largest wolf, the same silver and black one from the spring, stepped forward to meet them. Up close, the animal was even more impressive than Tommy remembered. It stood almost as tall as Tommy's waist and moved with fluid grace that spoke of perfect strength and control. Tommy scattered the herbs and stones on the rocky ground as Mary had instructed. "I come in peace to honor the old agreement," he said, surprised that his voice came out steady and clear. "I offer my protection in exchange for your wisdom." The wolf leader studied him for a long moment, yellow eyes reflecting the moonlight. Then it did something completely unexpected. It lay down and rolled onto its back, exposing its throat and belly in the ultimate gesture of trust and submission. One by one, the other 6 wolves did the same, until all 7 were lying vulnerably before Tommy and Lobo. The message was clear. "We accept you as our alpha, our leader, our protector." Tommy felt tears come to his eyes. The trust these magnificent wild creatures were showing him was overwhelming. He knelt down and placed his hand gently on the chest of the pack leader, feeling the strong heartbeat beneath the thick fur. "I promise to honor the partnership," he whispered. "I promise to protect you and help you protect this land." The wolf leader rose and touched its nose to Tommy's hand, then to Lobo's forehead. It was a gesture of greeting, acceptance, and alliance that needed no translation. As the wolves rose and arranged themselves in a semicircle around Tommy and Lobo, Tommy felt something change inside him. It was as if a door he hadn't known existed had suddenly opened, revealing senses and understanding he had never possessed before. He could smell things he had never noticed. The scent of rain still days away, the different types of sage growing. On the slopes below, the trail left by a family of rabbits that had passed this way hours earlier. He could hear the heartbeats of all 7 wolves, the small sounds of nocturnal creatures moving through the brush, and even his grandmother's breathing from 20 yards away. Most remarkably, he could sense the wolves' thoughts and emotions. Not as words or images, but as feelings and intentions that flowed directly into his consciousness. They were pleased, relieved, and hopeful. They had been waiting a long time for this moment. The pack leader communicated something that Tommy understood without words. "Tomorrow, we begin our real work." "What work?" Tommy asked aloud. Instead of answering directly, the wolf turned toward the valley below where Mesa Verde lay sleeping. Tommy followed its gaze and suddenly saw his hometown from a completely different perspective. He could see the places where the earth was sick from old mining operations, where chemicals had leached into the groundwater and left patches of desert where nothing would grow. He could sense the imbalance in the local ecosystem. Too many rabbits in some areas because their predators had been driven away. Too few birds because their nesting sites had been destroyed by development. Most disturbing of all, he could feel the fear and suspicion growing in the human community. People who had lived in harmony with the desert for generations were now talking about changing that relationship, about controlling or eliminating the wild things they no longer understood. "We have to heal the land," Tommy said, understanding flooding through him. "And we have to help people remember that they're part of nature, not separate from it." The wolf leader's approval washed over him like warm sunlight. Elena watched from her rocky perch as her grandson was transformed from an ordinary teenager into something much more significant. She could see the change in his posture, in the way he moved, in his entire relationship to the world around him. When Tommy finally walked back to her, Lobo and the 7 wolves following in a loose group, she hardly recognized the boy she had raised. "How do you feel, mijo?" she asked softly. Tommy smiled, and in that smile she saw echoes of ancestors she had never met but whose blood ran in both their veins. "I feel like I'm finally who I was always supposed to be, abuela. And I think I know what we need to do." Through the Iber, wolves dispersed as dawn approached, melting back into the rocky landscape as silently as they had appeared. But Tommy knew they weren't gone. They were simply taking up new positions, beginning the work of healing and protection that would occupy all of them for months or years to come. As he and Elena made their way down the ridge in the early morning, light. Tommy felt the weight of responsibility settling onto his shoulders, but it didn't feel heavy or burdensome. Instead, it felt like coming home to a truth he had always known but never been able to name. Below them, Mesa Verde was waking up to what its residents thought would be just another ordinary day. They had no idea that everything had changed during the night, or that their community now stood under the protection of an alliance older than their oldest memories. Tommy smiled as he thought about the conversations that would begin soon, the resistance he would encounter, and the gradual process of helping his neighbors understand that the wolves had not come to threaten them, but to save them. It would not be easy, but with Lobo at his side and 7 wild allies watching from the shadows, Tommy knew it was possible. The transformation in Mesa Verde began subtly, in ways most residents didn't immediately notice. Tommy started his mornings by walking through town with Lobo, but now their routes followed patterns that seemed random to casual observers. They would pause by the old mine tailings where nothing grew, and Tommy would scatter seeds he had gathered from healthy parts of the desert. They visited the contaminated creek bed behind the gas station, where Tommy left small bundles of sage and other purifying plants that Mary Crow Feather had taught him to prepare. Most remarkably, wherever Tommy and Lobo went, the wildlife began to return. Birds that hadn't been seen in Mesa Verde for years started appearing in small flocks. Rabbits emerged from the deep desert to graze in areas that had been barren for decades. Even insects seemed more abundant, creating the complex web of life that healthy desert ecosystems required. Sheriff Martinez noticed the changes first, mainly because his job required him to pay attention to unusual patterns. 3 weeks after the night ceremony on the ridge, he stopped Tommy and Lobo during one of their morning walks. "Son, I've been watching you," he said, not unkindly. "Every morning, same time, different route, and wherever you go, things start growing. Now, I'm not a superstitious man, but I'd like to understand what's happening here." Tommy had been dreading this conversation, but also preparing for it. The wolves had shown him that hiding the truth would only create more fear and suspicion. People needed to understand what was happening, but they needed to discover it gradually, in ways they could accept. "Sheriff Martinez, how long have you lived in Mesa Verde?" Tommy asked. "Born and raised here, 43 years. Why?" "Do you remember when the desert around town was healthier? When there were more animals, more plants, better water in the creek?" Sheriff Martinez was quiet for a moment, thinking. "I do, actually. When I was about your age, you could find all kinds of wildlife right here in town. Birds, small mammals, even the occasional deer coming down from the mountains. Haven't seen anything like that in probably 15 years. What if I told you that the land wants to heal itself, but it needs help? What if the animals and plants are coming back because someone is helping them remember where it's safe to live?" I'd say that sounds like something my grandmother might have believed, but she was full of old Indian stories that didn't make much sense to a modern person. Tommy smiled. "Maybe your grandmother was smarter than you thought." That afternoon, something happened that made it impossible for the townspeople to ignore the changes any longer. Mrs. Chen at the corner store called everyone she could think of to report that a spring had appeared behind her building. Not a trickle or a seep, but an actual flowing spring that filled a small pool with clear, cold water. "It wasn't there yesterday," she insisted to anyone who would listen. "I've lived behind that store for 12 years and there was never any water there. Just dead ground and some scraggly weeds." By evening, half the town had gathered to see the mysterious spring. The water was indeed clean and cold, bubbling up from between the rocks as if it had always been there. Tommy and Elena arrived to find people filling jugs and bottles, tasting the water and exclaiming over its sweetness. "This is impossible," declared Bob Williams, the retired mine foreman. "I know the water table in this area like the back of my hand. There's no aquifer here that could feed a spring like this." But Mary Hernandez had brought her youngest granddaughter, a 4-year-old who had no preconceptions about what was possible or impossible. The little girl walked straight to the spring and knelt beside it, cupping the water in her small hands. "The water is happy," she announced to the assembled adults. "It says it's been sleeping for a long time, but now it can wake up and help the plants grow." The adults laughed at this, but Tommy and Elena exchanged meaningful looks. Children often saw truths that adults had trained themselves to dismiss. Over the next few days, more springs appeared throughout the area. Some were tiny, barely enough to keep a few plants alive. Others were substantial enough to create small oases where desert wildlife could drink safely. Each one appeared in a place where Tommy and Lobo had spent time during their morning walks. The state wildlife officials who had been called about the wolves were baffled by what they found. Not only were the 7 wolves still present, but the entire ecosystem seemed to be experiencing a kind of renaissance. Dr. Patricia Sanchez, a biologist from the University of Arizona, set up a temporary research station in Mesa Verde to study the phenomenon. "I've never seen anything like it," she told Sheriff Martinez during one of his visits to her makeshift laboratory in the town hall. "According to all our models, this area should be in ecological decline. The drought, the old mining activity, the groundwater depletion, everything points toward desertification. Instead, we're seeing recovery at a rate that should take decades, not weeks." "Do you have any theories?" the sheriff asked. Dr. Sanchez showed him charts and graphs that tracked water quality, plant growth, and animal populations. All the lines pointed sharply upward from a date that Sheriff Martinez recognized, the morning after Tommy had gone up to the ridge to meet the wolves. "The only explanation I can think of is that some kind of catalyst has been introduced to the system," she said. "Something that's accelerating natural healing processes that were already trying to occur." That catalyst, Tommy knew, was the partnership between him and the wolves. Every morning as he and Lobo walked through town, they were joined by one or more of the pack. The wolves stayed just out of sight of most humans, moving through drainage, ditches, and behind buildings, but their presence was essential to the healing process. Through his connection to them, Tommy had learned that the wolves possessed an ancient understanding of how water moved through underground channels, how plants communicated with each other through their root systems, and how the spiritual health of a place affected its physical well-being. But the wolves could only guide and suggest. The actual work of healing required human hands and human intention. Tommy found himself working late into the evenings, following the wolves' guidance to plant specific combinations of desert plants in carefully chosen locations, to clear debris from natural water channels, and to perform small ceremonies that Mary Crow Feather taught him over weekend visits to the reservation. The most difficult part was dealing with the growing attention from outside Mesa Verde. Word of the mysterious ecological recovery had reached environmental groups, government, agencies, and scientists from several universities. Some wanted to study the phenomenon, others wanted to claim credit for it, and a few wanted to exploit it for commercial purposes. Tommy realized that he needed allies within his own community, people who could help protect what was happening from those who would disrupt it for their own gain. His first recruit was, surprisingly, Sheriff Martinez. The lawman had been watching the changes with professional skepticism that gradually gave way to protective instincts. When a group of developers from Phoenix arrived to investigate the possibility of building a resort around the new springs, Sheriff Martinez found reasons to delay their permits and discourage their plans. "I don't know exactly what's happening here," he told Tommy during a quiet conversation in his office. "But I know it's good for this town and good for this land, and I'll be damned if I'm going to let a bunch of outside profiteers mess it up." Mrs. Chen became another ally when she noticed that the spring behind her store had become a gathering place for the community. People came, not just for the water, but to sit quietly and talk with their neighbors in a way that hadn't happened in Mesa Verde for years. She started leaving benches and small plants around the spring, creating a peaceful space that seemed to bring out the best in everyone who visited. Even Dr. Sanchez, though she didn't fully understand what she was observing, became a protective presence. When reporters and curiosity seekers began arriving in town, she gave interviews that emphasized the need to let natural processes continue undisturbed. "Whatever is happening here is delicate and complex," she told a television crew from Tucson. "The worst thing we could do is interfere with it by trampling through the area or trying to replicate it artificially." But not everyone in Mesa Verde welcomed the changes. A small group of longtime residents led by Bob Williams worried that the attention would bring unwanted development and change to their quiet community. They began organizing to have the wolves removed and the springs declared a health hazard. "This is all very nice and mysterious," Williams said at a town meeting that drew the largest crowd in Mesa Verde's history. "But what happens when the state decides our little miracle needs to be managed by bureaucrats? What happens when the environmentalists declare this place a protected area and start telling us how to live?" His concerns weren't entirely unreasonable, Tommy realized. The partnership with the wolves was meant to benefit the entire community, not disrupt their way of life or expose them to outside control. That night, as Tommy sat by his grandmother's fireplace with Lobo at his feet, he contemplated the challenge ahead. The healing of the land was progressing beautifully, but healing, the human community would require different skills and different kinds of patience. 6 months after Tommy pulled a drowning puppy from the Rio Seco, Mesa Verde had become something unprecedented in the modern Southwest. A small desert town where humans and wildlife lived in visible harmony. The changes were no longer subtle or mysterious. They were obvious to anyone who spent time in the community. The 7 wolves had become an accepted part of daily life, though they maintained their wild nature and their distance from most humans. Children walking to school would sometimes catch glimpses of silver and black shapes moving parallel to their path, always just far enough away to feel safe but close enough to provide a sense of protection. Farmers reported that their crops were no longer troubled by destructive pests, while beneficial insects seemed to thrive. The elderly found that their arthritis bothered them less when they spent time near the springs that had appeared throughout the area. Most remarkably, crime in Mesa Verde had dropped to nearly zero, not because of increased law enforcement, but because the very atmosphere of the town had changed. People were calmer, more patient with each other, more likely to resolve conflicts through conversation than confrontation. Sheriff Martinez found himself spending most of his time helping tourists find their way around, rather than dealing with any actual problems. But success brought new challenges that Tommy had never anticipated. The first major crisis came when a team of scientists from the Department of Agriculture arrived with orders to capture and relocate the wolves. They had been sent by officials in Washington, who were concerned about the precedent of allowing large predators to live in close proximity to human communities. "I don't care how peaceful they seem now," announced Dr. Robert Crawford, the team leader, during a heated town meeting. "Wolves are apex predators with the capability to kill livestock and threaten human safety. We cannot allow public policy to be based on wishful thinking or local superstition." The town hall was packed with residents, and for the first time since the changes began, Tommy saw the community truly divided. About half the people present supported Dr. Crawford's position, worried about their children's safety and potential liability issues. The other half had experienced the benefits of the wolves' presence directly and opposed their removal. "Those wolves haven't hurt anybody," declared Mrs. Chen. "My granddaughter plays in the yard every day, and I've seen them watching over her, like guardian angels. They're not dangerous, they're protectors." "Anecdotal evidence is not scientific evidence," Dr. Crawford replied dismissively. "The fact that these animals haven't attacked anyone yet doesn't mean they never will. Our responsibility is to prevent problems before they occur." Tommy stood up slowly, feeling the weight of everyone's attention. Over the past months, he had grown taller and more confident, but he was still just a 15-year-old boy facing down federal officials and community leaders. "Dr. Crawford," he said, "what if I could prove to you that these wolves are different? What if I could show you that they pose no danger to this community?" "Young man, I appreciate your passion, but there's no scientific test that can predict animal behavior with absolute certainty." Tommy looked around the room, meeting the eyes of people he had known all his life. Then he looked at his grandmother, who nodded encouragingly. "There is one test," Tommy said. "Let me go out there with them. Tonight. Alone. If they're dangerous, I'll be the first to know." The room erupted in protests from both sides. Some people thought the idea was insane and would prove nothing. Others feared for Tommy's safety and didn't want him used as a test subject, but Dr. Crawford looked intrigued despite himself. "You're proposing to spend a night alone in the desert with a wolf pack?" "I'm proposing to show you what the relationship between humans and wolves can be when it's based on respect and understanding, instead of fear and dominance." Elena Martinez stood up beside her grandson. "And I'm proposing that this community has the right to decide for itself what kind of relationship It wants with the natural world. The debate continued for another hour, but eventually a compromise was reached. Tommy would spend one night camped in the desert with the wolves, supervised from a distance by both Dr. Crawford's team and Sheriff Martinez. If he emerged unharmed, and could demonstrate that the wolves responded to him as a partner rather than prey, the relocation would be postponed pending further study. 2 nights later, Tommy set up a simple camp in a small canyon about 2 miles from town. He brought only basic supplies, a sleeping bag, some water, a small amount of food, and Lobo for company. Dr. Crawford and his team established an observation post on a ridge overlooking the canyon, equipped with night vision equipment and tranquilizer, rifles in case of emergency. As the sun set and darkness settled over the desert, Tommy felt more nervous than he had since that first night on the ridge. Not because he feared the wolves, but because he knew that the future of the partnership depended on what happened in the next few hours. Lobo sensed his anxiety and pressed against his side, offering silent comfort. The dog had grown considerably since that day by the river, now nearly full size and clearly showing his mixed heritage. In the moonlight, his golden coat and amber eyes made him look almost magical. The wolves appeared just after midnight, emerging from the shadows like living pieces of the night itself. All 7 were there, moving in their characteristic formation with the pack leader slightly ahead of the others. They approached Tommy's camp with confidence but without aggression, settling into a loose circle around the small fire he had built. Through the connection he had developed over the past months, Tommy could sense Dr. Crawford's amazement as he watched through his equipment. The scientist had expected to see predators stalking prey. Instead, he was observing what looked like a family reunion. Tommy stood and walked to the pack leader, placing his hand on the wolf's massive head in greeting. The animal responded by touching its nose to Tommy's chest, directly over his heart. Then, one by one, each of the other wolves approached for similar greetings. What happened next went beyond anything Tommy had planned or expected. The wolves began to sing. It started with the pack leader, a low, musical howl that seemed to contain melodies within melodies. The others joined in, their voices weaving together in harmonies that spoke of ancient connections and timeless bonds. But the most remarkable thing was that Tommy found himself singing along, his human voice somehow finding its place in the wolf song. From his observation post, Dr. Crawford watched in stunned silence as boy and wolves created music together under the desert stars. His scientific training told him that what he was seeing was impossible. Wolves didn't sing elaborate songs with humans. They didn't arrange themselves in ceremonial patterns or respond to human emotional states with such obvious intelligence and empathy. But his eyes and his instruments were recording evidence that couldn't be denied. The song continued for nearly an hour, rising and falling like ocean waves, sometimes powerful enough to echo off the canyon walls, sometimes soft as whispered secrets. When it finally ended, the wolves settled down around Tommy's camp as if they belonged there, and Tommy lay down among them as if he had been part of their pack all his life. Dr. Crawford radioed to his team that the subject was safe and continued. Observation should continue until dawn. But privately, he was beginning to question everything he thought he knew about predator-prey relationships and the boundaries between wild and domestic animals. Tommy woke at sunrise to find himself surrounded by sleeping wolves. Lobo was curled against his side, and the pack leader had positioned itself between Tommy and the canyon entrance, the classic protective stance of a parent guarding its young. As the wolves stirred and began their morning routines, Tommy felt a profound sense of gratitude for the trust they had shown him. More importantly, he felt confident that anyone who had witnessed the night's events would understand that these animals were partners, not threats. Dr. Crawford's report to his superiors was unlike anything the Department of Agriculture had ever received. He recommended not only that the wolves be allowed to remain in Mesa Verde, but that the community be designated as a pilot program for human-wildlife coexistence. What I observed, he wrote, challenges fundamental assumptions about the relationship between humans and large predators. The wolves in Mesa Verde display behavioral patterns that suggest a level of social intelligence and cooperative instinct that our current models cannot explain. Rather than removing them, We should be studying them as a potential key to solving human-wildlife conflicts throughout the American West. The recommendation was approved, bringing researchers and funding to Mesa Verde instead of tranquilizer guns and transport cages. The town found itself at the center of a new kind of conservation effort, one based on partnership rather than management, on ancient wisdom rather than modern control. Tommy's role in all this remained largely invisible to outsiders. To visiting scientists and government officials, he was simply a local teenager with an unusual bond to animals. They didn't understand that he was the living bridge between two species, the human heart of an alliance that had the power to heal not just Mesa Verde but potentially entire ecosystems throughout the region. On his 16th birthday, Tommy sat by the spring behind Mrs. Chen's store with Lobo at his side and watched children from town playing in the crystal-clear water. 3 of the wolves rested in the shade nearby, no longer hiding but not intruding on the human celebration. His grandmother found him there as the sun was setting, carrying 2 glasses of lemonade and wearing the peaceful expression that had become her trademark since the changes began. "Any regrets, mijo?" she asked, settling beside him on one of the benches that now surrounded the spring. Tommy considered the question seriously. His life had become something far different from what any normal teenager might expect. He carried responsibilities that most adults would find overwhelming. His connection to the wolves meant that part of him would always belong to the wild world rather than purely to human society. But he also lived in a place where the air was cleaner, the water was purer, and people treated each other with a kindness that seemed to grow stronger every day. He had friends who trusted him completely, both human and non-human. He had learned secrets about the natural world that few people in history had ever known. Most importantly, he had kept a promise made not with words but with actions. The promise to help a drowning animal, to protect the vulnerable, to serve something greater than his own interests. "No regrets, abuela," he said, scratching Lobo behind the ears and feeling the contentment that radiated from the big dog. "I think this is exactly what I was supposed to do with my life." As if in response to his words, a wolf howled from somewhere near the edge of town. Not a call of loneliness, but a song of joy and belonging. Tommy smiled as Lobo lifted his head to answer, his voice joining the ancient chorus that now provided the soundtrack for Mesa Verde's transformation from a forgotten desert town into something entirely new. The boy who had saved a stray from the river had become the heart of a miracle that would ripple outward for generations, proving that sometimes the simplest acts of kindness can awaken powers that change the world.